SeanBell is a retired Royal Air Force pilot and Sky News military analyst. Welcome to our program, Sean.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for having me.
The war in Ukraine could end in the upcoming months, according to the Trump special envoy for Ukraine and Russia, Kit Kellogg. Also, Wall Street Journal suggests that Donald Trump can arm Ukraine to the teeth if Ukraine agrees with a ceasefire deal. What is the current chances for a ceasefire in Ukraine even this winter?
Yes, good day, Daniel. It's a really interesting question because although Donald Trump is not the president yet, in many ways, the current US president is finished. The king is dead. Long live the king. President Biden is seeing his time out. President-elect Trump is not in the chair until the 20th of January. And the strange thing about the American system is you have this sort of period, a sort of gap where it's almost like there's nobody in charge. And at the moment, everybody's waiting in anticipation because Trump had said he would solve the Ukrainian war in 24 hours. And of course, now that he's won the presidential election, everybody's wondering how he will do it. Now, the harsh reality is that whatever President Trump says, what he actually has done in the past is claimed he would solve lots of world problems and not actually solve them. But what he did do, it was a clear demonstration of where his focus, his intent was. And I think the clear message is that where President Biden was keen to avoid Ukraine losing the war, what's very clear is that President Trump is keen to stop the war. Now, how you do that, a ceasefire generally only occurs when both sides are enthusiastic about doing so. It does appear that President Zelensky is more open to the idea of a ceasefire. But of course, it's not clear to me or many Western analysts why the Russians would stop, because President Putin is on the front foot. His forces are making progress. He is grinding forward despite the massive casualties. And therefore, what is the incentive for Russia to even engage in conversation and talks? And that'll be the interesting part, I think, of the new Trump administration.
I also had the opportunity to speak with former Trump's national security advisor, Ambassador John Bolton, and he is confident that Vladimir Putin would agree with Trump's proposal on Ukraine because, according to Bolton, it would be the best way out for Vladimir Putin. Is he right?
The harsh reality is, Daniel, I don't know. The only person who knows that is President Putin himself. I think the thing that worries me at the moment is that everybody seems to be trying to find a solution for Vladimir Putin. And that means appeasing him. That means in some way rewarding him for his adventures in Ukraine. And if the West is to reward Putin, then that has profound implications for our global security into the future, not only with Russia feeling emboldened, but also potentially North Korea, Iran, China, other nations that will feel that the West will roll over if any nation decides to invade one of its neighbors. So I think the issue here should be that President Putin has illegally invaded Ukraine. It cannot be seen to get away with that. If it does, then, as I say, this will not be the last we see of an aggressive neighbor deciding to invade another country.
According to Politico, European leaders are discussing the possibility of deploying peacekeeping forces to Ukraine in case of a ceasefire deal between Ukraine and Russia. What is your take on such idea?
I think what's been interesting, Daniel, is that there are, you may have seen the Zelensky interview that was conducted by Sky News a few weeks ago.
Sure.
I thought that was very interesting because it was the first time that I've heard President Zelensky talk a little bit more openly about what would be required in order for the war to end. One of them issues was raised about territory, and President Zelensky was very clear that it was more important for the people of Ukraine to prevail than territory. Territory may come and go, but the Ukrainian people are vital to the future of your proud nation. And therefore, that was one of the things that he felt most important. And the second one, which relates to your question, was long-term security guarantees. He said that it was pretty clear President Putin would not stop. And one of the things that the Western leaders had to appreciate was that whatever President Putin signed, however he agreed to pause, he would not stop. And therefore, some form of robust security arrangement would need to be in place. President Zelensky cited the Budapest Memo of 1994. Now, many in the West would seek to ignore that, but the harsh reality is that America and the UK and Russia all pledged to guarantee Ukraine's sovereignty in return for giving up its nuclear weapons. And yet, when 20 years later, Russia invaded Crimea and 28 years later invaded Ukraine, the West really didn't respond accordingly. And President Zelensky has been very clear that without having some form of robust security arrangement in place, then there will be no way of securing a peace. And I think one of the reasons why the West is exploring different options is that NATO might be an option. I suspect that's not. But are there bilateral or trilateral security arrangements that could be put in place? And how do you make sure that the border, the new border, wherever that is, between Russia and Ukraine, is policed and enforced? And the United Nations might be a way of doing that. I suspect that's why that conversation has hit the newspapers.
There are lots of conversations about 40,000 peacekeeping forces which could be deployed to Ukraine. From your perspective, how many troops would be needed to properly enforce such long demilitarized zone?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? It depends what you mean by enforce. If Russia needed to be dissuaded, you would need hundreds of thousands of forces. In my own view, I think it's highly unlikely that President Putin is going to stop just because the Western allies believe that he should stop. I think he has seen weakness. He will continue to push further into Ukraine in the future, and maybe not just Ukraine. And therefore, the question is less about how many troops, but more about what is the political commitment of the West to ensuring that Russia does not have the ability to come and attack Ukraine again. I suspect the history has shown that United Nations forces are not always as militarily robust as perhaps we'd like them to be. Whereas having military bases on Ukraine soil, for example, an American base, a French base, a UK base, might mean that actually there is a permanent military presence on Ukraine's shore, which would therefore mean an attack against Ukraine would be an attack against those nations. I suspect that will be far more robust a way of protecting Ukraine long term than having a very, very large and potentially ineffective United Nations force patrolling the border.
So you believe that only permanent military presence by the West in Ukraine would be a solid security guarantee for Ukraine?
I think if you look at the history of the region, you'll be quick to tell me, Daniel, that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is only the most recent episode in 300 years of Russia trying to invade, trying to get rid of Ukraine's language, its culture, its people, its history, its heritage. And therefore, just because a US president-elect says that he's going to solve the problem does not mean that the threat from Vladimir Putin will disappear. I suspect this will continue, and therefore there has to be something a lot more robust than simply a signature on a piece of paper or potentially a few peacekeeping forces patrolling a border. There will have to be something significantly more robust if Ukraine is to have the confidence to rebuild and to create a new future for itself based on the foundations of this very difficult episode in its history.
Do you believe that Trump is able to persuade, to convince Putin to agree with a ceasefire proposal from your perspective?
Well, I think that's an interesting question, Daniel, because with a ceasefire, you either negotiate or you impose a solution. Now, it's interesting to see President Trump will want to negotiate, but of course he knows that President Putin will be seeking all of the various limitations, sanctions that have been put onto Russia. Putin will probably want those lifted. He'll probably want to return to normality. He'll want favorable status. In other words, lots of things that the West will be reluctant to provide. I think what is interesting, though, is that if President Trump was to impose some sort of negotiation, what levers does he have against President Putin? And that is most interesting, I think. And only Russians will be able to tell just how damaging this war has been to the Russian economy. It's not just about its huge increase in defense spending. We understand it's now gone up to nearly a third of all Russian spending. And by putting that in context, what is Russia no longer spending money on than it was spending money on before? It's seen a huge number of casualties, a huge proportion of its working population that have either fled or now badly damaged. That will take a generation to recover from. In addition, as we've seen in Syria, there are other parts of the world with Russian military involvement that are unraveling at the moment, and Russia doesn't have the capacity to deal with all of them. So it's quite possible that Putin is seeking an off-ramp, and that actually, properly negotiated, Putin may well simply settle for those 4 regions, the land bridge between Russia and Crimea, and of course Crimea itself. And it might be that that is enough for Putin to declare victory back in Russia, but also placate his desire for further ambitions into Ukraine. But again, I'm very concerned because any negotiation of that type will inevitably reward President Putin for his Russian adventures, and that may have long-term implications once Russia recovers from this latest extensive war.
And what kind of leverage Donald Trump still has over Vladimir Putin in Russia?
Well, as we said, one of the ways is that he is a carrot and a stick. So on the carrot, he may well offer ways for Vladimir Putin to re-enter the international global trade routes and potentially get rid of some of the sanctions. I think what's most interesting is the stick. One of the things that has been evident since the start of the war is that if NATO, if the US had got directly involved in supporting Ukraine, Russia would have been stopped in its tracks. Russia had hoped to prevail in a matter of days back in February 22, but it did not. And Ukraine has proven to be a very, very brave, stoic, and resilient adversary. Russia has gradually taken territory, but it has suffered a huge loss along the way. If the West was to get involved, Vladimir Putin knows that his forces would have no chance whatsoever. So it's quite possible that President Trump's stick would be that actually he would agree to escalate America's involvement in the war. I think what's really interesting, Daniel, is that the West has worried every step of the way about being seen as escalating when it provided anti-tank weapons, when it provided tanks, when it provided long-range missiles, and then when it provided fighter jets. But actually, all of this, if it was only seen as equivalents, Russia has used all of these weapons to attack Ukraine. It is not unreasonable that West would provide equivalent weapons back to Ukraine to fight against Russia. But for some reason, Putin has successfully framed this as an escalation rather than simply an equivalence. And I think President-elect Trump could well end up putting some pressure onto President Putin if he was to threaten to escalate America's involvement in this conflict.
However, in his latest interview with the Times, Trump said that he would not support US authorization to use long-range missiles inside Russia by Ukraine. Do you still think that he is in favor of any kind of escalation in military, in supporting Ukraine, or do you see this statement as a message for Vladimir Putin, as a sign that he can negotiate with Russia, that the United States is ready to lift some restricting measures against Russian Federation, Russian army, and can move forward with a peaceful settlement of this war, and can even cancel US authorization for Ukraine to use ATACMS systems?
It's very difficult to say, Daniel, because I remember before President Trump got in for his first term, he said he was going to build a continuous wall with Mexico. He said he was going to bring peace to the Middle East, and he said he was going to deal with that poisonous little man in North Korea. The harsh reality was that he was not able to do any of those things to completion. But it did give a clear idea of his intent. I suspect that away from the rhetoric, what he's saying and what his advisors are saying, what is clear is he wants to bring the war to an end. And he's offering an olive branch to President Putin to say, I'm willing to talk, are you? Now, nobody, certainly not Trump, will want to play all his negotiating hand in public. What he will be seeking to do is to demonstrate a willingness to talk and to entice President Putin to that negotiation. I don't think that President Trump will ever want to be seen as a weak global leader. That is not a legacy that he will like at all. So I think it's very unlikely that he's simply going to capitulate and find any way to bring the war to an end. But I do think he's trying to demonstrate to Vladimir Putin that he is willing to talk. And I think that's probably not a bad move at this stage. The trouble is we'll have to wait until after the 20th of January to find out exactly what that means.